Here's which one?
Oh, sure. All right. Hello. This is our second. What?
No.
Here we. Sorry. Stop.
Sorry, Jeff.
Okay. Welcome back. This is our second month back in person. We are super excited for Trade Desk here sponsoring or hosting us here. Still kind of working the kinks out, obviously. Still is our good friend. They sponsored us for how many years now?
Last 2 years.
2 years with a fantastic account, so we can't badmouth them. They're actually doing well. I think it's YouTube's fault this time. Don't know. It is definitely operator error. I'm not good at this. Tonight we have Will talking what
Oh yeah.
components.
Yeah, components.
Something about components.
Something compound-ish.
Compound components, yes. And Wyatt, who is online, he's going to be talking about React optimization stuff first. We'll give him, I'll give him the board and hang out afterwards. Lots of pizza, please. Lots of pizza.
Hey everybody, my name is Charlie. I work here at the Trade Desk. That you all come by. Bathrooms, you're gonna have to go out the way you came, walk back across the big stairs, and then you'll see signage on the other side. Not too far away, but they're open. And if y'all need anything in the office, I'll be hanging out. I'm a front-end engineering manager, so I can talk shop too. Yeah, let me know if anyone has any questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, thank you everybody for inviting me to this talk and giving me this opportunity to share some information around React optimization fundamentals. Some of this is coming from my experience in production and in the real world. So I'll just go ahead and start off by talking about who I am. My name is Wyatt Arent, or who TF are you and why should I care? So I have about 10 years of professional experience. I started on the front end and now I'm a full stack developer. Most of my front end experience is in React. I'm presently the director of engineering at a company that will go unnamed because the attention right now is on the Trade Desk. Thank you all for hosting this and being so generous. And I'm also spending my time with the nonprofit group Code for Denver, just as a volunteer, not a sponsor. And if you want to contact me, feel free to look me up. I mean, my name is basically a meme. It's like a word, right? So you can find me online pretty easily. That being said, we can go ahead and move on to the first item here. And I try to keep the slides pretty brief because I don't like to get too like wordy, texty. And really, we just kind of jump into like some real world examples. But first, we're kicking off with a haiku called Coffee with Friends. Barista makes coffee, always repeating. We already heard last steps. So what this means is this is like an analogy or a metaphor where you can imagine you're at a coffee shop and you order a muffin and pour over coffee and a tea. So first they announce we're heating up the muffin. And then later they say, oh, the muffin is ready. And they put it on the counter for you. And then they call out again, the muffin is heated up and ready and your coffee is heating up. And you're like, well, that was weird. Didn't they already say that? And they say your muffin's heated up and ready, your coffee's hot, your coffee's being poured. And then again, it's heated up, ready, coffee's hot, coffee's being poured, coffee's ready. Every single time that they say something, it kind of repeats the previous steps that they had before. So it makes you wonder, well, why are they repeating themselves like this? Why don't they just remember what they did before? So let's talk about what the barista at this coffee shop could have done differently. So if they only announced their updates instead of repeating all of their work that's already been done, that would have been way more efficient, right? It's like your coffee's ready, the end. If no more changes to the copy have been made, you don't have to re-announce it every single time. You don't have to re-update everybody. The other one is you could also update or contextually nest your updates. So you say coffee is hot, coffee is ready. Instead of having two separate updates, you just say, the coffee is hot and ready. And I mean, God only knows how the barista would have handled errors in this situation. So you can imagine how this could explode into becoming a much bigger problem. Moving on from that, I just want to check in with anybody. Do we have any questions so far or any concerns with this presentation? Everything going well?
Great.
Good, good, good. So moving forward to the next one is the measurements. So we want to go ahead and take a look at some sample app and see how we can determine if the app has a problem. And I want to note that Chrome, I really want to note that apparently, I did not mean to zoom in that much, that Chrome is one of the best browsers for development. I usually, for my day-to-day browsing, actually use Firefox, and I always enjoy it. But for the developer tools, I think Chrome is pretty superior, and I can go over some specific reasons why while I'm demonstrating this. So let me go ahead and open up a sample app here real quick. This is, the moment of truth when it's like, it was just working 5 minutes ago, I swear. So in this app, I'll go ahead and do a little zoom in here so y'all can see on the screen. We just have a form and you're filling out some information. You have first name, last name, email, friend's first name, friend's last name, da 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 da. This is kind of an approximation of a production app that I've actually worked on in the past. And the idea is that you have to go through and fill out all these fields, and then you can go ahead and submit the, the form to the backend. I have the Zoom chat open, by the way, if anybody has anything come up. It's easier for me to reach that than Discord at the moment because I am only working off of one monitor presently. Now, what we do to test it out, I think first and foremost is, just get your hands on the app and see how it works. Right. So I'm typing things in and I could kind of feel it's like a little bit sluggish, but to really get the idea across of like how bad the performance is of this, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of button mash. You see that there was like a huge pause and then everything appeared all at once, right? So I'll do that one more time. I'm typing like crazy. And then it appears, right? That's not Zoom that's lagging. That's the app for sure. So we're having a pretty serious performance problem here. And at this point, you want to figure out where that's actually coming from. One way that you can do this is by opening up the code and digging through it and saying, okay, like, is it in this part of the code? Is it in that part of the code? Like, where is this form being rendered at? Da, 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 da. That can be totally fine in some situations. But another way to do it, which I like to do quite frequently, which I find is very efficient, you could say, is to go ahead and jump into the developer tools. So you can do on a Mac, in my case, Command Option I, or you can of course just right click and then click Inspect. And there's probably something in the toolbar at the top. You can figure that one out because I'm not sure. So we can see we have some validation errors and it says there's 1,000 errors, which that right away is kind of a hint of like, well, why are there 1,000 errors that are occurring here, right? But if you don't have this kind of an error here, or if you want to do a little bit more digging because the app is more complex than this contrived example, then you can go ahead and jump into the performance tab. Let me do a nice little zoom here for everybody to see. So just up here in these tabs, you have performance. And the performance monitor, this is something that does exist in Firefox, but I find it's actually much easier to read in Chrome, first of all, kind of like going back to why I mentioned before that Chrome is better here. The other part too is that for whatever reason, last time I checked, at least like a week ago, if you try to view the source in Firefox, it'll give you like a link to some source code. It gives you an error message saying this has not been implemented yet. I'm sure Mozilla is working on it. What can I say? So in the meantime, you're in Chrome Performance tab, and then you have this circle right here, which is the record button. And what's happening is it's recording the performance of the app. So now you can see it says profiling, because this is also called a profiler. And I'm just going to go ahead and type in some stuff here for like a baseline. And then I'm going to type some stuff into the email, button mashing, and really trying to trigger that bad performance, that laggy, buggy thing that was happening. And we got it to happen, and we can click stop. So what's happening now is Chrome is taking those inputs and all of the data that it received, and it's compiling it into a nice list, into a nice viewable format for us. So we have in this view, which I'm used to seeing a little bit more zoomed out, so I appreciate your patience, is I have to zoom out just a tad here. There we go. At the top, we have the CPU. Well, excuse me, I guess like middle top, right? So from the top down, I guess it's frames per second, CPU, and then net. I'm assuming net just means like what's been rendered. And then at the bottom here, we have heap. So this blue bar at the bottom is heap. In the middle, that orange, that big old yellowish orange is CPU. And we can see the CPU is just freaking out right here, right? It's just nothing but a big old orange rectangle. So that's already a pretty strong indicator that something is going very wrong. And then at the top, you can see that there's also frames that are just like kind of lagging. It's barely rendering anything at all. So what I like to do is I'll go ahead and jump into the, let's close the console. We don't need the console. I'll go ahead and jump into the section. This might be easier to see now. What I'm doing is I'm dragging the timeline view so we can see at what point, right? Far left is when I first hit that record button. And we're just going to go ahead and shrink that view to a point where we just really want to focus in on where these problems are happening. And that toggles this area down here. Let me move my zoom stuff out of the way. Where these are all events or functions that are occurring within your JavaScript. So you can see that Chrome is actually telling us this is a long task, right? This took 5.5 seconds or 5.1 seconds to render. And in this task, probably like only one frame was rendered, right? That's the lag that we were seeing. And if we look down at this task, we can see it's filled with a bunch of key press events. And we can go ahead and click on one of those. I'm clicking on this one. It says the handler took 364 milliseconds. A key press event, or really any kind of user interaction event, should never take 360 milliseconds, right? The user will start to detect that there is a problem with your app if it's going above, I would say, like 50 milliseconds. Once you start passing like 100 milliseconds, you're really getting into some very problematic territory where your app doesn't feel very professional or very clean. So we can go ahead and click down into one of these events and see what's going on here. When I click it, we go down into these tabs here, right? So we have a summary of all the different computations that were occurring. And again, it's giving us a warning, this key press event, so 364 milliseconds. We're more interested in seeing the call tree. And the call tree is the full stack. I'm talking with my hands right now, but you can imagine the full stack of all of the functions that were called here when I did a key press. So what we're doing is we're drilling down into the stack of all of those functions. How do we know where to go from here, right? It's branching out. There's like function call, run microtask. What are all these things? Well, you really kind of have to follow your judgment here, and it's based off of experience. But what I like to do is like a good rule of thumb is you see total time. And this one took 200 milliseconds for a function call. I'm going to zoom in a bit more here for everyone. Yeah, it looks like Chrome is not letting me size it up a bit. That's all right. So in the function call, 200 milliseconds too much. We're going to keep drilling down. Keep drilling down. I'm going to go bigger here. Why am I continuing to go? Why don't I click into one of these code blocks here, right? It's like it's linking to code. Why haven't I clicked on this? Well, this is, I'm recognizing this as third-party code. I can see that based off of just my personal experience and also kind of intuition. It says React DOM, which I didn't develop on. You can usually tell it's like if the file is in your code base, then that's going to be part of your problem, right? That you can directly handle. I'm still drilling down, looking. And you'll notice the total time for this execution is barely dropping. That means that each of these functions actually is not really the problem. There's something going on underneath all of these. And right here, we have an anonymous function for bad input.jsx, which has taken 82 milliseconds to execute. And you can see a pretty severe drop off of 195 milliseconds to the next call, which is 93 milliseconds. 93 is still quite a bit, but this function right here, you can tell it took right on the self time as well as another way to see the left-hand side, 82 milliseconds for a function in your own code. So now we can go ahead and click into this code link. I just give it a click. And Chrome opens this up for us. Again, another difference between Chrome and Firefox. If I clicked that in Firefox, this is where it would present me with an error saying, I don't know how to open the code like that. Good luck. And we're looking at the bad input, and we can see that, actually, let me go ahead and show you. It shows 3-1. That means line 3, column 1, right? So line 3, and it even highlights it for you and everything. Yeah, this is the problem. This function is problematic. So for anybody wondering, if you're not sure why this is a problem, I'm not going to go too much into the details, but basically we're running a function at the render level of the React object or the React function. This is going to require a little bit of experience and knowledge of React functional components and perhaps React hooks as well. If you don't have a ton of experience with that or haven't used it before, that's totally fine. We're just going to show some examples of how to clean something up like this, how to optimize it. And yeah, again, let me know if you have any questions along the way. And thanks for joining in, Ryan. So that brings us to this next part of the presentation. Before I jump in, any questions? Are we doing okay so far?
Yep.
Cool. So we have this next part, which is memoize, right? Memoize that bleep. So memoizing is really just remembering previous things that you have done. It's just like writing a memo, right? You have like a notepad on the desk or something. You just jot down the thing and you don't have to keep like refiguring it out or whatever. It's just all there for you. So let's figure out how we could do something like that. Let's go ahead and share a new screen. One moment, please. Okay. So we have our bad input file here. I'm going to do a nice zoom in for everybody. And this right here is this is a React component. Okay. The bad input component for context is this is just like the text input you see right here. It's all it is, just a text input. So at the top level of our full form, we have a bunch of bad inputs aptly named, right? Hopefully, if you see this in your production code, then you don't even need to do anything I just told you. You already know there's a problem. First name, last name, email, and so forth. That corresponds to all those inputs you saw in the browser. What you can do is, first of all, close out of all of these extra tabs that we don't need. We saw that this was the problem, right? Using our browser. We can go ahead and memoize it we want to remember this computation. There's a lot going on in here. It's taking your values for your form inputs, and it's for every value in your input, it's revalidating everything in the form. So what that means is, like, if I enter in a single character in this one input, then every single input is going to be affected by that. Because every single input is now going to run this, and it's going to recompute those validators and all this stuff. So a couple of things you can do is, first, we can extract the user schema. We're taking the user schema out. We don't have to recreate it every single time. We can do something like user schema equals use memo. This is that React hook, right? And we're going to go ahead and return the object user schema. Now, every single time that the React component re-renders, it will remember that this memo has already been run because the dependencies haven't changed. And what are the dependencies? It's going to be like an empty block here. For anybody who is already familiar with React hooks, you see this and you're like, oh, I understand dependencies. This is like use effect or something. If you're not sure what's going on here, the first parameter, I'm going to try to be brief because I think I only have about 10 minutes left. The first parameter is a function that will return the computed value, and it will rerun this function anytime a value in this array changes. So if a value in this array changes, then it will rerun. But since there's no values in this array, it only does it one time, right? So we'll probably want to recompute it every time that the schema changes. Boom. Now the user schema will only update if we actually change the schema for our bad input. So that's one good thing. Another one that we can do is something like delete all of this. We can also memoize our result into something like this, use memo. We really don't need to rerun this validator every single time every input changes. So you could, probably do something like this. Formic.values e. This is basically saying if the value of my form input has changed, not key, ID is what we want. If the value of our form input has changed, then we're going to go ahead and rerun our validator. So now it should only do it if this one input has changed. It's an example of how you can memoize, or in other words, remember the computation that we had before. So every time that the render happens on the component, it will look here and say, oh, has this value changed? Oh, no, it hasn't. Okay, I remember this. I don't have to rerun this computation. Boom, we have the result. It's ready. It knows if it has been validated or not. There are other libraries that kind of bake stuff into this for you. Formic is a form library that I have used before, and it kind of has these performance problems. So you can use other ones as well if you're encountering that. But we don't really have time to go over that. I do want to go ahead and move forward into the next part of the talk, though. I know that was a whole lot to try to take in at once, so I will remind everybody to bring any questions that you have into Zoom or into Discord, and happy to go over that too. Go ahead and share my screen on the presentation. Okay, so we have memoized our changes in our component, which in the case of our app here, this would actually be a significant performance enhancement, or even just changing the library and not using Formic. And since we've done that, another enhancement that you can do is looking at contexts. So contexts are a way of sharing state and data between React components. If anybody here has used like React Redux, contexts are kind of similar to Redux, but they're like a little bit lighter weight, you could say. Really good for preventing props drilling. So if you have a whole bunch of components that are like heavily nested, then context will make it easier for you to pass those props down through components. But how can context become problematic? Well, let me go ahead and open up one more example here. I don't have too much more time, so I want to be mindful of that. So let's say that we have a context here called user.js. And a context is really going to be like a model. It basically just stores data that you can then pass down into your other components, like I mentioned. I was going to try to write all of this out, but since I'm looking out for the interest of time, I also have a backup of the file too, so we'll just go ahead and copy this. The benefit of writing it out is I think it would be easier to explain what's happening here. But I'll just go over step by step. So we have our user context defined here. Thank you, Will. Just checking the chat on that. We have our user context provider. So this is going to provide our data to our components. What data do we want to provide for our components? Well, an example that you would see in production quite often would be like user profile data, right? You want to know what the user's name is in various parts of the app, various parts of the view. Maybe you want to know what their profile picture is. Maybe you want to know if they're like loading something or if it's updating. So we have these 3 state objects. And we're passing these down into our state here. Our user context has a state name, profile picture, loading, and then we also have our actions. The structure of this is actually not necessarily standard. This is just something that I do, a convention that I have adopted personally, but you're welcome to do any kind of structure that you want. All right, a user context, I think, doesn't even need to be an object. It could even just be like hello as a value. But I like to pass in an object with this shape. Sort of emulates a Redux kind of thing. And if we look at our components, well, let's go ahead and open up the app and see what it's doing here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Which is having a hard time loading. One moment, please. That is interesting. I'm actually not sure why this is not loading. It was just, like I told you before, it was just loading a minute ago. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through what's happening here, just because we don't have too much more time. And maybe along the way, we'll even diagnose the problem. We can take a look at the console error. Thank you for the suggestion, Ryan. Let's see if there's any console errors that are popping up here. Oh, it looks like it just loaded. Oh, it's because we're zoomed in so much. It actually was working. We just were zoomed into a white part of the screen. So this is all that the app does. It has the name, it has the profile picture, and we have a button here, update profile picture. If I click update profile picture, the app changes that and it says loading for a second, and every single time it changes. The way it's doing this is through the manipulation of the context. So we have our profile picture here. The profile picture component is taking the user context and it's taking out the state loading, and profile picture. For anybody who's not sure what's going on here, this is called destructuring. This is a destructuring pattern. Another way of looking at it is something like this. So if we want to get like this state loading, you can do something like this instead. My context loading equals my context.state.loading. Right, this is equivalent to this right here. That's destructuring. Okay. So we're getting the loading, we're getting the profile picture. And we also have an action here, set loading. So anytime that the image finishes loading, we're telling the context, okay, we're all done loading, and we're setting that state to be false. And then if it is loading, right, if this value is true, then we're going to display that loading text right there. And then user detail, a lot simpler. Probably should have started with this one. Is we're just getting the name from the state. So we're going use context, user context. We're getting the name from that context, and we're rendering it right here. So again, this value here corresponds to this value right here, because we're just passing that down the value chain. If anyone's not familiar with context, you're probably seeing this and going, my God, what is happening? I promise you, if you read through it or do another, watch another video or something, or I'm sure one of the fantastic people here will do a talk on it at some point, this will all click and you'll have flashbacks to this talk. You'll be like, oh my God, I totally get it now. So the user detail is just rendering the name. And then at the top level for the app, we have this user detail component. Sorry, I'm right-clicking for no reason. User detail component, and then we have the button update profile picture, which is also using the context. So to wrap this up of why this is problematic and what's happening here, if I click update profile picture, we're just setting loading to true. We're setting the profile picture to a new value. And the user detail is not using the loading variable, right? The user detail is not using the profile picture variable. The name variable never changes. The whole time it's static, right? It stays the same. And yet, when you interact with the app, and we can see through the console logs, anytime that we click on update profile picture, everything is updating. Everything is re-rendering. We're updating the app, updating user detail, updating profile picture. Why is user detail updating? Like, we're not changing the name here, and that's all it's using, right? And not only that, but it's multiple times. Everything is updating like 2 to 4 times. Isn't that bizarre? Well, the reason this is happening is because anything that subscribes to a context, anything that uses the context is going to re-render anytime that context changes at all. So even though I'm just using this one variable, well, it doesn't matter. Because I'm using this context, any value within it that changes, this whole component is now going to re-render. This is a pretty common problem that you'll actually find in development. A lot of people who are newer to context, or even in production apps, you'll find these problems. There are solutions to this. There are apps that do observables. I don't have time to get into the details of that. I see a question from Brady asking what settings did I have in the editor that shows the level indentations with the colors and spaces. I'll get to that question in just a moment. Thank you, Brady. That's a really great question. There are observables that you can use. So that way it will only update the component if you change that one variable. Also, Redux is kind of built for this because Redux has like these dispatchers and then like map state to props or whatever. I haven't used Redux in a while because it's just like so chunky, but that's what I'm talking about here in the presentation, right? For shared state with many writes, you should consider Reductor similar. But I mean, if your app is very read heavy, or at least that part of the state is very read intensive and you're barely changing it at all, like, let's be honest with ourselves, how often are you really going to change your profile picture like that? It's like, if it's not that often, maybe this kind of performance problem isn't a big deal. Ideally, you wouldn't see it like that, but like, okay, whatever. But if you're seeing other parts of the app where you're constantly interacting like this, like I have to click this all the time, right? And you're always having this lag occur, then maybe the context isn't the right pattern for you, right? Or maybe you want to break out the state in a different way. And that's pretty much the gist of it. So again, read heavy, great for context. Write heavy, consider something like Redux and so forth. And that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you all so much for your time and for coming today. I will be on the Meetup Discord, so I encourage y'all to ask Jeff about that, or whoever Jeff has to help out with the Discord link. I don't mean to stockpile you with more work. Perhaps Will. I see a message from Will asking to share about my my work. I can talk about that briefly. Thanks so much. So I work at a company called Squadformers, which is it's a fully remote company. It's basically an agency. Pretty young, just founded, I believe, about 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago. I've been with them for about a year now. And I work on various apps, mostly like finance apps, most recently, but also there's messenger apps and so forth. Kind of balancing my time between people management and tech management, but as the company grows, there's going to be more and more people management along the way. And yeah, like I said before as well, working with Code for Denver, encourage everyone to take an opportunity to check that out too. And you know, a great way to help the community. Or talk to Jeff too. You know, about, no, don't talk to Jeff. About, you know, any presentation ideas that you might have or helping him out. Great guy, really great people to work with. And I love this meetup. So thank you all.
All right, thank you very much, Wyatt. Yes, we are always looking for great presentation. Performance is always a very slippery surface when you start thinking about it. The multiple renders of all of the different consoles can be a red herring. Recoil is a fantastic state, context state. I switched out from Redux to use Recoil. It's actually pretty awesome. Anyway, next up we have Will here, who should be ready to talk about components. Again, I'm hanging out on Discord, so if anyone has questions, feel free to post there. I can stop Will if I need to, but until then, go.
All right. Do we have anything to like put my laptop on? I'll get by for now. I'll be good. Let me share my screen. If for some reason I'm not coming through clearly remotely, please say something to Jeff and we'll figure that out. I'll use a stack of chairs. I actually presented it like a code camp once off a chair. And it was like, oh, this is better because it was like a much lower chair. Let's try this. Am I sharing?
Yes.
I'm sharing, right? Cool. Turn full screen on this and make it a little bit better. Zoom doesn't come across. I've got like little things to minimize that. Okay, cool. Let me go back to the beginning of the slides. Okay, cool. Hey everyone, I'm Will Klein. I'm here to talk about compound components. There's a lot I can say about this. I decided to keep tonight a little bit more on the brief side, but definitely going to get you up to speed with what they're about, why they're worthwhile, and why they're worth choosing when you have choices. Okay. I'm on Twitter at @WillKlein_. Don't forget the underscore, or you're going to get lots of spam because Twitter is really great about handling that. I work on design systems. If you didn't know what design systems were, it's kind of it's like slowly blowing up. I'm hearing more and more about design systems. I didn't know what they were a few years ago. And then like a year and a half ago, I joined a design systems team. I still don't really quite know exactly what they are, but it has to do with design and providing kind of really good guidance for product teams on like, what are the colors you should be using? What are the fonts? And what are like the common components and how should they look and how should they behave? So design systems make it easier for us to build our applications because it kind of handles those like smaller details that should be consistent across our product. So we can focus on the more higher level user experience concerns that are the more product level concerns. I work as a developer advocate at Workday. That actually means that I work with a couple thousand developers potentially within my company, supporting them using our design system. Our design system is called Canvas. So we have a component library built in React right now that is called Canvas Kit. And when you've got a couple thousand developers, maybe 100 plus projects actively using it, there's a lot that can come up. So I've gotten to focus on helping developers figure out the best way to be effective building their products. And definitely having a good design system component library is a big piece of their toolkit. So that's what I get to focus on all day. And the biggest question we get by far, not biggest, but well, yeah, kind of. The most common question we get all the time is, how do I do X with component Y? So people are trying to figure out, hey, I've got this, I see what's in the documentation. I need to do this though. And they're always asking like, what's the right way to do that? And hopefully our documentation is doing a good job, but we always come up against this, we've historically come up against this limit of what our component provides out of the box, and what they're trying to do doesn't always fit within that box. So stepping back, I really do want to start at the more fundamental level of how do we configure our components? And I think if you've been doing React for any period of time, you know about props. And props I think of as, I think of as one-dimensional. So you have a component that is just one JSX element, say, and then you've got maybe like 5 props that you support. And I think of those as just one-dimensional. You could maybe have string values or number values for some of those props. You might have something that's richer where you're passing an object, maybe a configuration object. Things can get a little bit more complex with that, and you can support some different things. But I always think of props as like, if you're just dealing with a single JSX element, if you're just dealing with props, it's very one-dimensional. Render props and children is where things start to get a little bit richer. And I'm gonna jump into this a little bit because I realize not everyone has used render props recently or has played around with children. Let me see, I think I need to, cool. So here's a really quick render prop example. So the idea is that you have a prop on this list component, and instead of just giving it an object or a string or something like that, you can give it a function. And this is where you might say, hey, I've got this list component someone else gave me, and I want to define how some of its children render. I want to say that one part of that component, say its list items, are going to render in a particular way. So you can pass in a function. And render props are fantastic, particularly when you've got collections where you're trying to iterate over things and you need to control over how that list is going to render. And there's some things you can do with, if I scroll up, here's the list item, the list component. That's just taking in render as a prop. And then it's also taking in items. In this case, it's got a collection, mapping over it, and then actually calling render. I'm gonna play with this just a little bit just to demonstrate what is possible with render props, and also to demonstrate a little bit about children. So I can actually, what was I gonna do? I was gonna change, I'm trying to remember, like, what was I gonna live code? All right, let me see if I get this right. No, my brain's, I'm totally brain farting on the live code. So there's some things you can do with children where you can change render to children, and you can actually, instead of just, actually, I'll just do it. Instead of having what you're rendering as a function, you can go straight to say, hey, I'm gonna take what are the children, you can pass a function in as the child, as a child component here. And I think I got rid of something I don't want, yeah. Now I remember why when I did this off a chair last time, I almost fell all over. I'm quite clumsy. All right. You could do some things like this, and I really did want to show this just a little bit because it starts to get into what we're going to talk about some more. So you can do things like say, hey, I'm going to pass in a function that's just the children here. And I think I need to like change render over here to children. And I think this should still just work. Yeah, that still just works. So you can do things like this. And you could not just have like one render prop, you could have multiple render props and name them different things and say, hey, the header is going to be this function and some other, the list is going to be this other function. And you do things like that. So you can get pretty far with that. And even if you start, I don't know, moving beyond render props, it's still a tool that's going to come in handy, even if you're doing something like with compound components. Go back here. All right, let's talk about compound components. So I'm going to show a really quick tabs example. Tabs is a really good component where I kind of like see the right level of complexity where this starts to come in handy. So this is a simple little like demo app that we had. We're going to start selling coffee. And I've got just these different tabs to show different lists of coffees. And if I go over to the code, this is kind of that one-dimensional API I talked about where you've got a single element, it's just the tabs component here. And then in this case, we've got this one prop that's items, and it's just this rich view data that has things like title, and then it's got the content type in here. This is kind of like render props where you've got like actual JSX elements in the object, and you can do things like that too. But this isn't really, so let me talk about the challenges with this. And this is what we actually had a ton of in our component library for a while. We just had these very one-dimensional components. And somebody would say, hey, I want to style the tabs different. And then, okay, we've got to add some way to configure that using maybe a different prop or maybe enriching that view model, that view data object that they're passing in. Now it has to follow a certain pattern for them to be able to style that. Or maybe they want to disable a tab. Or maybe they want to add data IDs, data attributes directly on certain elements within the tree. And as soon as you start getting into things like that, where you're like, I want to customize things in the tree, you start to see that, well, I'm not looking at a tree, I'm looking at just one element. And this solution starts to fall down very quickly. And we ran into this, basically this never ending loop that we can never break out of, where people would ask for things and we were building in support. Feature after feature in all of our components, and we'd end up with not just one prop, but maybe a dozen props, and it starts to get unwieldy fast. And we're always kind of chasing our tails on this, trying to support all the use cases. And we found out the hard way. You really cannot keep up. The more product teams, the more developers you have using this, the more use cases you have. It just falls down really quickly, this pattern of doing things. So I'm going to jump over to. There we go. So I'm going to jump over to kind of the new way of how we built our tabs components. We actually released this a year ago. And when I first looked at this, let me zoom in on this a little bit. When I first looked at this, I thought, oh man, there's a lot of JSX here, but it's all right there. And there's this big kind of like pro con, like, is this worth it? There's actually even some more complexities where we can do things like hooking into the behaviors and kind of like the state underlying this. But right on the surface, we can see kind of the whole tree of what is getting rendered at the end of the day. And let me see here. I actually want to show you something. And this is one of the aspects of compound components that I actually really like, is that here I am, this is the tabs component here. This corresponds to that root tabs kind of container. It says div with a role equals tab list. And then if I go into the actually, no, sorry, is that it? Is that the right one? No, that's the right one, tabs list, okay, cool. And then I've got these buttons, and this corresponds to each of those tabs items. And if I actually modified if I like added a prop to tabs item, and I made it like a valid HTML attribute, that would pass on through to this button directly. And that's one of the things that is really key about compound components is you can pass in props that are specific to that component that is part of its API, something that you've implemented in React, and you can take those things and you can do things with them. But you can still, at the end of the day, just directly drop in, I want this HTML attribute to be on this tab item, and then that will pass on through. So that could be a data attribute. You could also do things like taking that tabs item and maybe use a styled function to create a styled version of that button to make it look a little bit different. So before you had to ask us to support a certain style, or maybe you had to do things with theming, but when you are given access to everything in the component tree, you can start to directly hook in to those things and start to directly style them, directly modify, add attributes, and do other things. You could even potentially swap some of them out. That's pretty neat too. Let's see what else I can show you about this. One other thing that we found that by going to this model is we were handing more knowledge to the front-end developers consuming our library. So before we were completely abstracting how tabs were implemented. But when we handed them this, we start to expose directly not just the DOM tree, but potentially how the DOM tree hooks together. So if you haven't ever really looked at how tabs can get wired up, I'll show you just a couple quick things about this. So in each of these buttons, there's an ARIA controls, and then there's an identifier. It's like tab panel and then something generated. That tab panel corresponds to a div somewhere else that has role tab panel. And that has an ARIA labeled by, that's an ID that was back in that button. And this ID is what that button has that ARIA controls mapping to. Sorry about this, just connecting a bunch of things. Basically, they're wired together with IDs. And this is, can't think of anything right now that's really important, but I know it's come up where when we're starting to expose these things directly, I think it's actually really good to not be giving everyone a black box of like, here's this tabs component, just work with it. But giving them back the HTML and kind of just giving that information to our developers has proved beneficial in various ways. And definitely if you start to want to customize this, like I think in this example, we've got 5 different tab panels that match each of those tab items. You could do something else where you've got just a single tab panel and that is dynamic. And you hook into which tab item is being selected, and then you key off of that to load the right content. And when you start to do that, and you start to customize this API, or start to work with this API, you start to hook into those accessibility elements more directly. And I'll just throw in a pro tip right there. You start to build these things yourself. You'll start to find yourself on w3.org and like looking at the accessibility specs for these components to see what is the right way to build tabs, what is the right way to build a drop-down component, or to do a pop-up. Pop-ups are a really big one too. And that is something that any good component library is going to follow as closely as they can. And it's not easy even with those specs. I would say accessibility is still a bit of a wild west of what's the right way to implement these things that works consistently across all the screen readers. That's a pretty fun problem that we get to work with a lot. Let's see what I got next. Cool. So don't take my word for it. Or our word for it. I'm gonna show you another example. This is Chakra tabs. And so the same type of tab component here in my little example here. I already had the DOM tree open. I kind of already walked through how things map. But they got a tabs component, and within that they've got a tabs list, and then they've got tab panels with tab panels inside that. And that's another principle of compound components that we found just really important, is a very one-to-one mapping of React components, React elements to the DOM. That is usually like 90% of the time the way to go. There's still, I think I'm running into it right now with radio buttons and checkboxes. When you render a radio button and you style it, you end up with, well, you just end up with a bunch of stuff. That's not just one element, like one div that you're styling. It's not just the input you want to style. You end up with its own little subtree of things you want for style circle, essentially, for a radio button. And that is a case where we're figuring out the API we want for our compound components right now, but we're considering abstracting that, making it so that you don't have full access to the tree there. we're making a logical separation of like, this is the button that you click on, and we're gonna black box what's inside of that, because you'd end up with this very rich. If we made it one-to-one, it would give you more than you needed, and you could still have the scenario where if it didn't give you what you wanted, it didn't look the way you wanted, you could use a different one, implement your own, or drop in your own little button inside of our tree. Let's see what else I got. I already talked through this. I looked at the API with ours. This is the Chakra tabs. Oh no, actually this is Material UI's tabs. Oh yeah, just one more example. This is Material UI. They've got other things. One thing you'll see at the first element here is a box. One thing that we found that every design system that we've looked at has, and we've started to find a lot of success providing as well to our users, is layout components. Things like box, flex, different utilities that make it easier to do very common things. I won't get into that too much, but in this case, they've wrapped a box around their tabs list, or like the list of their buttons. And then they've got their tab panels like they did before. This is an interesting sort of counter example or different example than the one I showed before, because there's not like a wrapping tab panels around tab panel. So they sort of break that one-to-one at that level. And I can't remember if I look into what they render. Oh, here it is. Let's see what they do. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing necessarily. It's just what they've done. So they've got that div around that. That's the buttons. That's the box, I think. And then they have, oh, there's the tab panels. So then they don't have something wrapping that. So actually this is a one-to-one, and they just don't have something wrapping all that. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's just a nuance. Okay, that's the Material UI. I just talked about that. Cool. I'm going to talk about a couple other random things about compound components that kind of like, I don't know, make them really effective. One thing that we like to see is when you have polymorphic elements. And what I mean by this is this list might be a UL, or it might be an unordered list or an ordered list by default. This is Material UI's API. They provide a component prop, and component equals nav means that when they render that list, they're going to render it as a nav element. You might make that a ordered list instead of an unordered list in another use case. Chakra calls this the as prop, and we use the as prop in Canvas Kit. I think another good word for this would be element. Component's just fine, I think, though. Maybe component can be a React specific element. I usually see it as an HTML element specifically. So that's a really nice thing to have in compound components when you're looking for those, or if you're building them. Yeah, here's the documentation for Chakra. They call it the as prop. Here, where's the as? Yeah, they do, like here they have a card as a button. And so then when it renders, it's not just rendering a div with whatever roles, it's rendering a button specifically. And there's actually a bit of plumbing inside of each of these libraries to make that easier for the library maintainers to do in a repeatable way across all the components. You don't usually need to worry about that. Something I'm actually looking at is taking our like kind of internal utilities that do those things and trying to separate those out in your own library, because it's like a framework for our component library that is like very specific. The framework is specific to how you build components. And that'd be a really nice thing to have. I haven't seen anything in the wild yet that focuses on that. So I think there's opportunity for different people to try to do that. Cool. Oh, okay. Another pro tip when you're looking for a component library or components that do things, or if you're building your own, is have lots and lots of examples. We have this examples section here. Some of these are actually kind of recipes for things that used to be in our design system that we sort of like said, hey, we're not going to maintain it as part of our design system anymore, but a lot of people need these things. So we have a page header, cookie banner, global header. And so we've put those recipes together. In this case, I've selected in on how to use a select component with Formic. And this is something that a lot of teams, we don't use Formic everywhere, but a lot of teams we're using Formic. So we found a lot of benefit from, we get a question, how do I do X with Y, component Y? And it's like, well, you can do those things. And we've found that taking those answers and kind of like starting to add an example section and making that richer has been really beneficial. Another pro tip is TypeScript. Whether you like TypeScript, prefer TypeScript or non-typed JavaScript, I really don't care. But if you're dealing with a component library, if you're dealing with a design system library, you want that to be a TypeScript. It's going to benefit the people not using TypeScript, the people using JavaScript. When they start to type a component in the props, they're going to get IntelliSense and VS Code and other tools. They're going to give them the right suggestions to really make, kind of lead them in the right direction without them having to guess or look at the docs for what they need to do. And definitely internally within the design system, within our library, it's worth, we probably pay a higher toll, a higher cost of developer effort to maintain our types properly. That's as with any library, but we've found it's absolutely essential, even for us, to have those types in place. Context. Wyatt talked a bit about context as well. We could definitely use a talk on context. That's its own topic for sure. But one of the things, I'm not going to get into it too much with our stuff, but when we wire together our components, Tabs has this, and we've got some other examples. I think our pop-up system has this, but we use context to maintain kind of that component state. Remember, we had that tree of like, you got your tabs, and then you've got your tabs panel, tabs items, and your tab buttons, and then your tab panels and all that. Maintaining that state of which one's being clicked and which one is active, that's a model. So we use context to manage that model. And it's a really, really great application of context. Whether you use it for application of state, I don't know if that's the right way, but definitely when you're dealing with component state component state, you're working across multiple levels of the React tree, context is really great for that. We actually have some utilities where you can actually import a hook, like use tabs model, and then you can start to configure it. So out of the box, you don't have to worry about it. But if you start to customize using our tabs or one of our other components, you can basically sort of hoist that model out of the component, use the hook to kind of get it into your own scope, start to pass in configuration, pass in your own event handlers, pass in your own state guards. So when it wants to transition to something else being active, it can do like a little logic check, or maybe it's being controlled by something external to the tab buttons. Maybe there's like some filter in some nav menu somewhere. Using context and being able to hoist that model is something that we've had a lot of success with. So you can really do anything with our components without having to like fork them or do whatever. You can like hook into the actual state and the state machine going on there. Storybook. I don't really have a huge like favorite on what's the best way to catalog your components and present them. We use Storybook. Biggest thing I think I've had a problem with is customizing their navigation. That's a little bit tricky, and I wish their navigation was better. But it works for what we're doing. And if you're getting started, I don't think you can go wrong just running with Storybook. If you find that you have a use case where you want to break out a Storybook, do that later. It's a great way to get started with doing component libraries. All right, I think that was actually everything I had. So I want to see if anybody has questions. I know I kind of ran through that pretty quickly, yeah, any questions about this? Can bring up examples. David?
Is Canvas Kit open source?
Oh yeah, Canvas Kit's open source. Yeah, it's not like, so I'm not here to like tell anyone to use Canvas Kit. Actually reminds me. So we primarily are like focused internal to Workday of like supporting developers with it. And we do support some partners that are outside of Workday building like integrations and customizations. They want it to be consistent with our look and feel. So that's kind of a nice to have as well. But one thing that we found with building our components is we're always looking at other design systems. How did IBM's Carbon design system do this? How did Chakra do this? How did Material UI do this? How did Shopify do this? And that's something that's really, I think, healthy actually about the design system community is everyone's kind of like figuring out their own way of doing things, kind of sharing notes, comparing notes. We've had a lot of like these coffee chats, like on Wednesday mornings at like 10 o'clock, where we get on a big call with Shopify or Carbon, IBM, and like just talk to the people there, like, hey, how do you do this? We ask each other questions. And it's a very like very open community where everyone's, not everyone has their stuff open source, but everyone's really eager to share as much as they can about here's what we're struggling with, here's what we're figuring out. And some of those groups are really, are doing a really good job, not only sharing open source, but writing about it, putting out videos. So we're starting to do that a little bit more. Thank you.
Is it a good idea to create a design system?
When is a good idea to create a design system? Good question. Ooh, that's a really good question. It depends on how much is going on in your product. Depends how many developers and product teams you have. If you've got one product team and there's maybe, let's just say there's 5 of you, and you're building a product that's, I don't know, maybe got like 5 or 6 pages, not a lot of complexity. Some of those might get a little deeper. You probably don't need a full-blown design system, style guide, everything like that, where everything's super well defined. But when you start to have multiple teams, you have multiple designers, you have multiple teams of developers, or you've got more than one product, that's when it starts to become a maybe. And definitely when you get to like 5 or 6 teams, a couple different products, maybe, it starts to become like, yeah, you really knew that yesterday. You kind of like it's like burnout. You don't like know when you're in burnout until like, wait, oh, I'm in burnout. Like you don't know when you're going to burnout until you're there, and you're like, oh wait, I need to do something about this. It's kind of like that with design system. I think for a lot of companies, they're like, they wake up one day, they're like, yeah, we've got a huge problem with consistency across our product. We don't like have a clear place to look for what's the right font size for this, what's the right colors to use in our buttons, things like that. And I think there's one of the challenges I think in the current like tooling options is, and there's a couple of things people work on this, but there's not like a really easy way to say, I want to bootstrap a design system really easily and just go in and customize a few things and be off to the races. Everyone's kind of rolling around, and I think that's going to sort of evolve where we're doing this enough times with Storybook and other things where we're going to start to kind of shake out what's a good kind of common tool chain that some people might want to start using. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you having the same latency problem that is having the context? They can show context in here.
Oh, same what problem?
Your previous speaker talked about issues with context API. I'm asking if you have that same.
Yeah. You're asking if there's any issues with using Context API, and I've definitely gotten the question of like, hey, do you have performance issues? Like, I remember when Context came out, I was like, is this going to perform when you're like hooking in some potentially a giant React tree and everything's got access to that state and so forth? We're not. Usually we're dealing with a more limited scope of what has access to that context. So we're not like bubbling this context up the whole application. It's usually down to a subset of the tree that's specific to a component. So I don't think we're going to run into any problems with context. We definitely haven't seen that. Somebody I work with, Nicholas Bull, is really into performance, and he's a really good expert on that stuff, and he's kept an eye on it, and we really haven't seen any challenges there. So when it comes to using it inside of compound components, I feel like it's a really good tool, and we haven't bumped up anything yet. It's a great question. Jeff, is there anything on Zoom or Discord?
It was just pointing out that model is in state plus events that operate on the state versus model configuration that is controlling the event lifecycle.
Yeah, that sounds right. What was that in Discord or?
That was.
Yeah. If anyone sees that message, that sounds about right. I didn't talk too much about models, and I didn't show what that exactly looks like, but we have this model tree that looks like it's got events, and then so when there's event handlers, it's got guards. And this is kind of getting the state machines where you can guard against a state transition, basically define a function where it can have some logic and maybe access other things. And then there's basically state. So like, what is the active tab? Things like that. And again, you want to, like, I didn't highlight this too much, but you want optionality in your components where you don't have all that complexity at the outset. You want to be able to opt in and say, hey, I need to hoist that model and get those things. And there's some of those things that you can get without hoisting a model, like in a read, sort of like a read-only way. You start to get into being able to invoke lifecycle events and saying, hey, I want to be able to activate a tab. That's when you you definitely need full access to the model. Sorry. Any other questions? Yeah.
Another one for you.
Please.
The example you had where you're doing the like component or the as prop.
Mm-hmm.
So example being like card as budget.
Yep.
Is the primary reason for doing that accessibility, so that the actual HTML element gets rendered into what the screen reader would expect?
I'll just repeat the question briefly. Yes, the question is, when you have that polymorphic ability where you can specify as or element and say that, or component and say that this thing is going to be a button or something else, that was the question. Is that for accessibility? Potentially. We hopefully get that right out of the gate. But I used to be a product developer. I used to just like try to use these components and like try to do things with screen readers. And as you get into very specific use cases with your applications, where I worked on a chat application and we had like a drop down element. We actually used Ken C. Dodd's what was it called?
Drop down.
What?
Drop down.
Drop down?
Or downshift.
Downshift, that's it. What was it? Downshift. Really good. I think it used render props to do a lot of things I talked about. Can't remember if it was compound in any way, but to do the screen reader experience, we were really doing something that was not well defined in some spec of like, here's how you do these things so that the navigation is clearly presented to a screen reader in a proper way. So I will say that is where I can really see it coming up. I gave you the example of like, you might have that list, you want to make a UL or an OL or an nav. That's a really good one where like, it could be a bunch of things and it's all valid depending on the use case. I can also see that because of accessibility, yes. Because of accessibility, I could see where you might need that as prop or that component prop where you need to not have it render as something by default, but override that to be something else that is specific to your use case. I don't have an example off the top of my head, but I know that it gets really rich when you get into making truly accessible experiences where you need to figure something else out that isn't what was originally defined by the component. Great question. All right, I'll stick around after this. I'll stop taking questions live. I want to give a big thank you to Jeff for keeping this meetup going in the last couple of years. It's been really hard. There's how many people are here? Did we count? 18. Oh my gosh, we got. The other thing is, and my talk is done, but I'm going to talk about meetup stuff now. So I'm a co-organizer of the meetup. I've been with the meetup practically since it started. It's a lot of work to do it, and Jeff and David have really stepped up, especially with bringing this back to in person. So we do apologize for some of the live stream stuff and getting all that information out. We're going to do a little retro on what we can improve and keep getting better at that, because this community is just so valuable to each of us. I have made friends here. I've made colleagues here. There's 3 people off the top of my head that I work with right now that I met at a meetup that just came up and said, hey, like, what do you do and where do you work? And now we work together. To the people I work with right now, I met at either this meetup or at a JavaScript conference. Like they're on my team right now. So like I see that potential whenever I get together with you. It's like we're probably going to be working together someday. It's a small world, and it's great to meet people at this meetup. So we're going to try to do a better job connecting people to jobs. Speaking of which, if you're in the Discord, we have a jobs channel or a hiring channel. Trying to post things there. You are all welcome to post if you're hiring. We know that a lot of places are laying off right now, and a lot of things are getting. It's a little shaky right now. I don't think it's the end of the world or anything like that. But you know, some people are being affected negatively by the current times. So we, as organizers of this meetup, definitely see this as like an opportunity to come together, meet each other, make new friends. Thank you all for coming, whether you're online or in person. We really want to make sure that we're connecting everyone with each other and making the best of our careers. One more thank you to Trade Desk. Charlie stepped up big to host us here. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for helping. This is fantastic. And we're hoping to keep coming back month after month. Thank you to Gusto. David, you work at Gusto, right? Yes. Gusto is sponsoring food this month. Thank you, Gusto. They're fantastic. I've got some friends there besides David. Some great devs there too. Thank you to Technical Integrity. They're our recruiting sponsor. Working again on figuring out how we can better present jobs, but they've got some React roles open right now. I know I think they got a React and Python and a React Native. So find me on the interwebs. I gave you my Twitter handle, Klein _ if you need that, or jump into our Discord. That stuff is posted. What am I missing? Anything else? Stickers? Speakers. Oh yeah, we're always looking for speakers. We have a speaking channel in our Discord. I posted there's like a Google form sign up. If you have any ideas, please just come on up. And it doesn't have to be a 20-minute long talk. I was practically winging this. You could come up and just make something up in 5 minutes. It'd be a lightning talk. It'd be really quick. We really like new speakers of the lifeblood of this meetup. And that's something that I'll just say that it usually takes effort for us to reach out to people and say, hey, can you come give us, can you give a talk next month? We'd love to hear you from you. And usually when we do that, we have good results. So that's me doing that right now. It's like, we'd really like to hear from you. Every single one of you. We'd love to have you speak at the meetup in the near future. If we have a lot of people, we'll just do a bunch of lightning talks. That'd be great. That'd be our dream come true. Anything else? There's stickers on the table over there. Yeah. Oh, one more thing. So we're moving off Meetup, and I'm going to delete the future events. I'm going to put them back up, but with RSVPs totally closed. I kind of dropped the ball a little bit on making sure we got the word out to remote attendees for how to join Zoom this month, but we'll get better at that and automate a little bit next month. Meetup made it really hard to do certain things like who's remote versus in person. And we found out when we moved to Tito very quickly that over half, I think we have 40 remote RSVPs versus 25 in person. And last month, we had a number like 66, and I think 20 showed up. And that was like, it followed the pattern, but we couldn't tell who was remote versus not. So we have a lot better control over that with Tito. Thank you everyone for switching to that, who did. And we're gonna move that for the long term. To get the word out, we do lose something with Meetup, that whole like discoverability of here's where the events are and here's how they email it for you. So we're figuring that out. We're going to use our Twitter, twitter.com/ReactDenver, and we'll use our start using our newsletter to get news out for the next month. So work on our website, help wanted. If you want to play around with Gatsby or rewrite it into something else, we're okay with that. Whoever wants to work on it, you can choose the stack as long as it's something other people are interested in. Okay, I'll stop talking. Let's hang out. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
There's lots of pizza. I don't want to take home free pizzas on the train. So
Thank you, everyone. I'm shutting down now, so thanks for coming.